Just days after North Korea conducted its fifth and biggest nuclear test to date, South Korea warns the country poses an imminent threat. So, should the world be concerned about its nuclear ambitions, and what can be done about it? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It was North Korea's fifth nuclear test and its most powerful. It's been called provocative, unacceptable and intolerable. Now, 3 days after that launch, a warning from South Korea that its neighbour is capable of another test at any time. The UN has promised new measures against Pyongyang, with countries like the US calling for tougher sanctions. But even that doesn't seem to faze the North, which says the push is laughable. We'll be speaking to our guests in just a moment. But first, more from our correspondent Harry Fawcett in Seoul.
Well, South Korea's president meeting with the two leaders of the main opposition parties for the first time since elections earlier this year. She says she wants a united front to show to the South Korean people that their leaders are taking on the issues of national security and indeed the economy in a united way. It follows North Korea's fifth nuclear test last Friday, and it also comes on the same day that the Defense Ministry says that the South Korean intelligence services and their US counterparts assess that North Korea is prepared, ready to carry out a sixth nuclear test at any time. Basing that on exactly what intelligence they're not saying, but they say that the test could happen in a branch of the tunnel number 2, which was used on Friday at the Punggye-ri nuclear test site, or in the so far unused tunnel number 3 at that site. If it happened, that would be a third nuclear test in 1 year. Already it's unprecedented that 2 should take place in 1 year, and it does represent a real acceleration of North Korea's nuclear program, which has very much worried the government here as it is governments around the world. There's been a sharpening in tone of the South Korean language, talking about massive punishment and retaliation. The United States says it's sending B-1B bombers to the Korean Peninsula on Tuesday, a day later than initially planned. And also it's been announced that the USS Ronald Reagan, the giant aircraft carrier stationed in Japan, will be joining South Korean forces here in October for a major military drill. So a real projection of force being shown towards North Korea. But at the same time, North Korea has continued to show defiance and accelerating its ballistic missile and nuclear programs in spite of all this pressure from external powers.
Well, North Korea is the only country that's carried out nuclear tests in the 21st century. Its first so-called successful atomic bomb test was in October 2006, according to state television. More nuclear tests came in May 2009 and February 2013. And in January of this year, North Korea said it tested a hydrogen bomb, which is more powerful than an atomic bomb. Experts, however, dispute that it was a hydrogen test. Nevertheless, that prompted the UN Security Council to impose tougher sanctions. Pyongyang's also been test launching ballistic missiles. It says that they'll eventually be used to carry nuclear warheads. Let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Beijing, we're joined by Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies. From Seoul, joining us via Skype, Daniel Pinkston, lecturer in international relations at Troy University. And from Boston, Jim Walsh, Research Associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Security Studies Program. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Daniel Pinkston, let's start with you. Provocative and destabilizing, a grave threat to regional and international stability was how President Obama called it. But what can world leaders do about North Korea's nuclear ambitions?
Well, we don't have very many good options. I think the best thing to do is to demonstrate resolve, raise the costs for North Korea, and extend deterrence to allies in the region, and ensure that North Korea does not use these weapons. But we will be moving into a dangerous era as we go forward.
Victor Gao, how does Beijing view Friday's nuclear test by North Korea?
I think Friday's nuclear testing by DPRK is indeed a serious provocation and the violation of the United Nations Security Council resolution. The Chinese government has condemned this nuclear testing by DPRK and has urged the DPRK government to exercise maximum restraint and discontinue with the nuclear testing. I would say that the East Asian region, as a result of the continued testing of nuclear weapons and launch vehicles by DPRK, is probably the most dangerous region in the whole world, because we are faced with continued and escalating nuclear threat. That gives more reason for countries like the United States, China, Russia, and the two Koreas, for example, in particular, to find a way to sit down at the negotiation table to address the underlying causes of the rising tension. And I think keep piling up more weapons into the Korean Peninsula does not solve the problem. We need to address the underlying reasons giving rise to the tension. And in this case, dialogue and diplomacy remain the only viable option, even though there is dwindling hope that diplomacy and dialogue can reverse the dangerous trend on the Korean Peninsula.
All right, we'll get into the diplomacy in just a moment. Jim Walsh in Boston, do you agree with what you heard there? And does North Korea have the ability to mount a nuclear warhead on a missile?
Well, I agree with both my colleagues. I agree with Daniel that we don't have a lot of options here. I would say we have a few more than he listed, but none of them are terrifically promising. They're not magic wands. And I agree with Victor saying that certainly diplomacy has to be part of that. Sanctions by themselves don't solve problems. It's sanctions combined with a political strategy. We had success in taking Iran's nuclear weapons program off the table because we combined sanctions with negotiations and got a good agreement. Now, diplomacy, it takes two to tango, or in this case, 6 parties to tango. It's not clear that the North Koreans are prepared to do that, but I do think we have to explore that as an option. Now, as far as the North's nuclear capabilities, clearly they have, the horse has left the barn here. They have a basic knowledge of nuclear weapons. They can probably build a very simple gun device like was used in World War II, and at a minimum, deliver it by a plane. So that, they've crossed some threshold. Now, they're not all the way at the other end here. They don't have a secure second strike. They've yet to demonstrate that they can build a reliable intercontinental ballistic missile, but they seem to be getting pretty good at medium-range missiles. And so it's a matter of time. Now, the question is, what are we going to do with that time? I think we can improve sanctions rather than simply doing the same old, same old. We can do different sorts of things. But again, it'll have to be sanctions combined with other policy instruments if we're going to prevent North Korea from reaching the final stage of nuclear development, to which they're not there yet, but where they're at causes plenty of problems and plenty of dangers.
Daniel, do you agree with that? Why does North Korea continue to rattle the international community? What are its aims with its nuclear program?
Well, I think the domestic politics and ideology matter. Of course, North Korea has agency. They have a vote. They have an influence on the outcome. If you read the literature, listen to the statements of the government and what the leadership believes, they believe that nuclear weapons have great utility. They provide benefits to the state. In particular, 3 things. They believe that nuclear weapons guarantee security of the state and security of the regime. Secondly, they believe that nuclear weapons will deliver economic development and economic prosperity. And third, they believe that nuclear weapons are necessary for the state to gain respect and prestige in the international arena. So nuclear weapons are non-negotiable from that position. They've said it many times. It's part of their identity. I think they will only give up their nuclear weapons by force if we disarm them by force, or if there's a revolutionary change inside North Korea.
Victor, you talked about the diplomacy that's required on an international level, but I just want to know to what extent China perhaps holds the key here. Economic sanctions have thus far transferred almost all the external leverage on North Korea now to China. Is more effective implementation of existing sanctions by China the way to go now?
No, I think China has joined the international sanctions initiated by the United Nations Security Council, and I can mention in detail that the Chinese government has really gone to the hilt in implementing these sanctions, and the extent and the magnitude of such sanctions that the Chinese government has imposed on the Chinese companies, both in terms of importing and exporting into and from DPRK, is really the strictest, the highest level of sanctions ever. And on the other hand, I think if you put yourself on the DPRK situation, they are talking about a major threat to the survival of the country, to the survival of the political system and the regime. And they are very much worried about this color revolution initiated by the United States in other parts of the world. And they want to defend themselves against any possible worst-case scenario. Whether you agree with that or not, that's another issue. But they apparently have behaved in such a way and conducted themselves in such a way that possessing more sophisticated nuclear weapons and missile delivery system may help them to avoid the worst-case disaster for the regime. Now, that brings out this philosophical question as to the underlying reason behind their eagerness to experiment and deploy the nuclear weapons. We in China do not agree with that rationale. We want to change the DPRK's thinking, but we need the cooperation of all the parties concerned, including, in particular, the United States. DPRK for years has insisted that they want to talk to the United States about a peace treaty between DPRK and the United States before they will ever think about giving up the nuclear program. Whether we agree with that or not, that's another issue. But the reality is that they want to make sure that no one in the world will change the regime in DPRK. We need to address these underlying problems in a very, very straightforward way. No one wants to have a DPRK in possession of nuclear weapons and occasionally threatening to use these weapons against the United States or other countries. That's the worst case scenario for East Asia. We want to prevent that. We want to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. But all of us need to tango to the same rhythm in order to achieve that ultimate goal.
Jim, what do you make of what you've just heard? I can see you smiling there. And I wonder, do you think the Obama administration's policy of strategic patience towards North Korea has failed? Will the next president of the United States have to adopt a very different policy towards North Korea?
Well, I've never been a fan of strategic patience. You know, I understand why it happened. President Obama came to office in early 2009, extended his hand to the North Koreans. The North Koreans responded by conducting a nuclear test, and he probably said to himself, look, I've got a global recession, a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, and a bunch of other things going on here. I'm going to spend my time on this. Why should I waste my time on the North Koreans? So understandable, but not great policy, and I think this kicking it down the road has got us to where we are today. As far as Victor's comments, I appreciate them. I'm in favor of a peace treaty negotiation. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't think that's what's really driving this. I'm more in Daniel's camp that this has a lot to do with regime survival and not color revolutions. I mean, my gosh, the color revolutions were in the 1990s. It's 2016. You know, there are other things going on here. But and on China's enforcement of sanctions, if you look at the trade numbers, and remember, 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. In the early months after the UN sanctions, in the March, April, May period, those trade numbers did seem to go down, but then more recently they have rebounded. But let me point out there are other things that China can do. And again, I'm in favor of negotiations, but there are other things China can do. My colleague John Park at Harvard and I have a new study out on North Korea sanctions. One of the things we argue is that what's really helping the North Koreans here do WMD procurement is they hire private Chinese companies. That's where they're getting all their sophisticated procurement capability. So it seems to us that the Chinese government can use domestic laws. You know, don't even worry about international sanctions. Domestic laws, the anti-corruption campaign, anti-counterfeiting laws, anti-drug trafficking laws, and focus part of that on the private Chinese businesses that are helping North Korea accelerate its weapons and missile programs. So I think there are a number of things that China can do. Obviously, China is not going to want to squeeze North Korea to the point where it cracks and collapses. I get that. It's not in their self-interest, but there's more that can be done.
Daniel, I'll get to you in just a moment. Victor, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I think China need to do whatever that's the right for achieving the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. There is no doubt about it, even at the risk of estranging the relations with DPRK. However, for whatever China needs to do is just one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that China and the United States really need to get onto the same page, and we really need to reach this strategic vision together as to how to deal with the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. From the Chinese perspective, we cannot see a United States being a potential threat in the South China Sea on the one hand, but then constantly Washington asks China to do so many things on the Korean Peninsula. From the Chinese perspective, we want to see a consistent Washington, a Washington that China can trust, a Washington that is highly predictable, a Washington with the same agenda, and China can really get together with the United States in achieving these major solutions for the burning issues in the world, including the rising tension on the Korean Peninsula.
All right, Jim, I know you'll want to come back on that, but Daniel, let's come back to you. To what extent do you think North Korea is taking advantage of the current mistrust, this strategic mistrust between the US and China that exists right now?
Well, once again, I think you have to look at North Korean politics. It's stunning to me how often China is pretty uninformed about North Korean politics, how the system works, what the ideology is, what their strategic objectives are. North Korea holds the keys to the program. And back to this issue of strategic patience, I'd like to clear something up. For a successful negotiation or for a negotiated settlement to be reached, there must be convergence of interest. There must be some bargaining space. Without denuclearization as part of an agreement, there is no bargaining space. And as far as the Obama administration goes, strategic patience is not a policy. It was never the policy. That was the bargaining strategy in the bargaining game in the six-party talks. And when you have a superior fallback position or the alternative to no agreement, and when you're in a superior position, you should be patient. You shouldn't rush to a poor agreement. The policy of the United States is deterrence and containment. And if deterrence fails to punish North Korea by punishment or denial and to restore deterrence, and if necessary, fight the war. We have to begin to discuss some very unpleasant possibilities of what things would trigger the use of force against North Korea.
Do you agree with that, Jim? Is the way forward perhaps a trilateral strategy? You know, Beijing, Washington, and Seoul getting together to sort out North Korea?
Yeah, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Daniel. Daniel and I agree on a lot, and we disagree on some things. I don't think it's all deterrence, containment, and more fighting. I do think there is a space. Now, he says, Daniel says, well, denuclearization. Obviously, I'm in favor of denuclearization. The Chinese are saying they're in favor of it, but it doesn't mean that you get there in the first negotiation. Both sides have signaled an interest in, at various points, in a freeze. You'll remember that Chairman Kim at one point said he would freeze tests, missile tests, I think it was, if the U.S. and South Korea stopped their military exercises. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous proposal on its face. That isn't, a real fair trade. But President Obama, I thought, responded quite interestingly by saying, you're going to have to do better than that. That's bargaining language. I think in the near term, we should be looking to freeze these programs and then on the road to rollback. And as far as Victor's comments go on Washington, I agree wholeheartedly that the U.S. and China have to be on the same page, and they haven't been on the same page with respect to North Korea. The only good thing about this nuclear test, if there is a good thing here, is that perhaps this is a moment to press the reset button, one that works, and for the U.S. and China to get back on the same page. But that doesn't mean the U.S. is going to give in to China on all these other issues. It seems to me, and China's been able to do this in its foreign policy, and the U.S. has too, on areas of common agreement, you sort of come up with a common plan, and then in areas where you disagree, you disagree, and you compete with each other. And yes, sometimes one pollutes the other, but in general, we have a common interest here, and we need to get back on the same page.
Okay.
Daniel knows I'm not a big fan of THAAD. I thought THAAD sort of threw us off that course. I hope we can get back on course where the states in the region are on the same page and therefore unified in the face of North Korean provocations.
Victor, picking up on what Daniel was saying, could you ever foresee a situation in which China would be willing to signal to the North Korean regime that it's prepared to apply the kind of pressure that would put the regime's survival under threat?
No, I would say that in order to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, it will require major countries, especially China and the United States, to be on the same page. Without getting China and the United States onto the same page, then DPRK will play China against the United States and play the United States against China. Eventually, both China and the United States will end up being losers, and then tension will keep rising. And unfortunately, eventually it may reach a point of no return. And then conflict or even war may break out. You may see the dangerous prospect of a repetition of another Korean War. That will be the worst case scenario. That will be a disaster for DPRK, a disaster for South Korea, a disaster for China, as well as for the United States. Therefore, I think it's worthwhile for China and the United States to come up with all the wisdom and courage and vision as they can muster and come to the same page on the DPRK's nuclear weapon program to make sure that peace and stability will prevail. Now, if you do not become a wholehearted friend on the South China Sea or all the other major issues which China considers as a major threat to its national security, you cannot expect in a realistic term that China will become wholeheartedly on the same page with the United States on DPRK.
All right, Daniel, I'll get to you in just a moment. But Jim, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I mean, that's the nature of international affairs. No one agrees on everything, and it's not about doing anybody favors. China isn't going to do the U.S. any favors. The U.S. isn't going to do favors for China. Countries act based on national interest. It is in the U.S. national interest for North Korea not to have nuclear weapons. It's in Chinese national interest not to have nuclear weapons. We should coordinate. We should do a better job. I'm in total agreement with Victor on that, and I think both sides have made mistakes there. And again, I hope we correct this, and this is an opportunity to do that. But we're not going to all be, Sweden or something, where we all agree on everything, and we can only cooperate if we agree on everything. That's never going to happen. So we need to carve out spaces where we can agree and work hard on those. I mean, China was very helpful in getting the Iran nuclear agreement, even though we had disagreements in other areas. So I think that's possible.
Daniel, Ban Ki-moon called on the Security Council to remain united and to take appropriate action as far as North Korea is concerned. Are you at all optimistic that a diplomatic solution to North Korea's nuclear program, its ambitions, can be reached?
I don't think so. I think it's very, very unlikely. But nevertheless, we must maintain a robust sanctions regime to raise the cost of North Korea and also to signal to third-party observers. If North Korea can break out of the NPT and build a nuclear arsenal with impunity, and if there are no consequences, what is that telling everyone else in the world? In fact, I'd like to maybe have my own nuclear weapon in that case.
But Daniel, I mean,
so I think that's the very wrong signal to send.
Will sanctions work, further sanctions work, when they haven't so far?
Well, it depends case-by-case basis. But on North Korea, and back to what Victor was saying about China and the U.S. being on the same page, we might have a 1 million-page book, and China and the U.S. might be on the same page. But if North Korea is not on the denuclearization page, it doesn't matter. North Korea, you will have to disarm them by force, or there will have to be revolutionary change within North Korea. Those are the two options. And in fact, North Korea's nuclear weapons are aimed at China as well. In fact, North Koreans, they despise China more than they do the U.S. They feel they have to have nuclear weapons to gain and earn the respect from China, whom they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and they actually despise.
All right. I'm afraid, I know both Jim and Victor would love to come back on that point, but we are right out of time. We're going to have to end our discussion. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us on Inside Story. From Beijing, Victor Gao, via Skype from Seoul, Daniel Pinkston, and from Boston, Jim Walsh. And thank you for watching too. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time just by going to our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.